Ashland Close in Bushy isn't the sort of street where sirens usually linger. It's a quiet cul-de-sac at the edge of Hertfordshire. Neat hedges, parked hatchbacks, a thicket of trees that turns gold in late afternoon. On Tuesday, 9th of July, 2024, the calm on that short curve of pavement fractured into a national headline. By nightfall, 3 members of one family, Mother Carol Hunt and her daughters Hannah and Louise, were dead inside their own home. The man police urgently named in connection with the killings was a 26-year-old from North London, Kyle Clifford. To understand why the story shocked Britain, you have to picture the Hunts the way their neighbors did before the blue tape and floodlights. Carol, in her early 60s, had the warmth of someone who never forgot a birthday and always asked after your dog by name. Her husband, John, is a familiar voice to racing fans across the country, a commentator whose calls have threaded through countless afternoons on radio and television. Their daughters, Hannah and Louise, were close in age and closer in spirit, 2 sisters who kept a small dog grooming studio running in an outbuilding at the rear of the property, and who shared the kind of shorthand siblings develop over a lifetime of inside jokes. That Tuesday began like most English summer days. Dew, light cloud, a damp breeze, a to-do list that included clients dropping off nervous spaniels and terriers for trims. At some point after lunch, a man came to the front door. Later, investigators would say the house's doorbell camera captured a portion of what happened next. A casual pretext, a few words, the threshold crossed. Inside, the first violence unfolded. Carol was attacked and left fatally wounded. The timeline that followed would be reconstructed from audio, messages, and movements captured on nearby cameras. Louise spent much of the afternoon in the outbuilding, going back and forth between the side gate and the house in the routine rhythm of a home business. She re-entered the main house after 4 p.m. Minutes later, there were sounds of struggle. Over the next stretch of time, long enough to suggest both intent and calculation, the attacker remained on the property. A crossbow had been brought to the scene. A knife had already been used. When Hannah approached early that evening, trying to reach her mother by phone and then coming inside, more violence followed in quick succession. Just before 7 p.m., emergency services were called. Armed officers and ambulance crews converged on Ashland Close within minutes, moving past the neat hedges and up the path that friends and clients had used 1,000 ordinary times. Inside, they found devastation. Carol, Hannah, and Louise, fatally injured. Outside, the low hum of generators started up as the sky deepened from summer blue to police light blue, and the cul-de-sac became a command post. What the public heard almost immediately was stark. Police were searching for Kyle Clifford in connection with the murders and believed he may be armed with a crossbow or other weapons. Residents across Hertfordshire and North London refreshed their phones with a kind of collective dread, reading the same 2 instructions again and again. Do not approach, call 999. The appeal named neighborhoods where searches were focused. Helicopters orbited. Door-to-door inquiries began. Patrols extended into woodland edges, parks, and the cemetery paths of Enfield. News desks scrambled to add context. Reports explained that crossbows, unlike firearms, could legally be possessed in the UK without a certificate, a gap that suddenly felt like a canyon. Analysts debated lethality, range, and the niche corners of online marketplaces where such weapons are compared with the same breezy enthusiasm you'd find in a camping forum. But the abstract conversation about policy never quite detached from the human specifics of Bushy. A mother and 2 daughters killed, a father and sister surviving in a house that felt, to millions of listeners, like their own living rooms. Because for years, John Hunt's voice had been a companion across dials and afternoons. By late evening, the manhunt had enlarged into an anxious vigil. Police units traced routes from Bushy to the London borough of Enfield, where Clifford lived. Search teams swept through green spaces and into the stone-quiet rows of a local cemetery. The next day, after roughly 22 hours of urgency, officers found Clifford there with serious injuries. No police firearms had been discharged. He received medical treatment at the scene and was taken to hospital under guard. As the immediate danger receded, a second wave of shock rolled in, heavier, because it carried names and faces now familiar to the entire country. Photographs of Carol, Hannah, and Louise, smiling, ordinary, alive, ran alongside images of police tents and white-suited forensic teams carrying evidence cases down a short path lined with lavender. A steady stream of tributes appeared. Colleagues describing Carol's kindness, clients recalling how gently the sisters handled anxious dogs, friends sharing tiny snapshots of who the women were when the world wasn't looking, playlist preferences, garden chatter, the way they always remembered to text home safe after late drives. Meanwhile, the legal process set its slow machinery in motion. After hospitalization, the suspect was moved into the custody track that leads from charge to first appearance and then, depending on pleas and evidence, toward trial. In the months that followed, the case would broaden beyond Bushy. New charges added, hearings scheduled, and finally, in 2025, admissions and findings that fixed responsibility in the plain, heavy language of the courts. But on that first night, what the country knew was simpler and unbearable. 3 women were gone. A family beloved by listeners had been shattered by a targeted, deliberate attack. And a weapon most people associate with medieval reenactments had become the instrument of a very modern horror. If you stand at the top of Ashland Close in your mind, you can still see the practical details that defined that day. A front door that opens inwards, the outbuilding door that thumps softly because the weather strip is loose, the fence latch that sticks unless you lift while you push. The dog bowls near the patio, a row of shoes inside the hallway, muddy trainers, ankle boots, a pair of slip-ons dusted with dog hair. All of it the palette of ordinary life, which is why the violence felt and still feels like an intrusion not only into a single address, but into the notion of home itself. The second-by-second timeline of what happened on Ashland Close reads like a series of doors opening and failing to close again. Early afternoon, the house followed its usual rhythm. Dogs dropped off at the rear studio, text pings from clients, a kettle boiled and left to cool. Sometime after 4, a knock at the front door broke that pattern. A man, someone the women knew by sight, stepped over the threshold. The house camera by the hallway captured him crossing into the frame, voice low, posture deceptively casual. What happened in the next minutes turned an ordinary Tuesday into the fixed point around which every later hour would orbit. Carol was attacked first. The opening violence was sudden and close, inside the front of the house where a silent weapon offers its own terrible advantage. A crossbow doesn't announce itself like a firearm. There's no crack that warns the street. By the time Louise re-entered from the garden studio, the kitchen door hinge still soft from years of use, the attacker had not left. A second attack followed, then a third when Hannah arrived and tried to reach her mother by phone before stepping inside. The sequence, mother, then one daughter, then the other, mapped the ordinary roots of a family home. It also mapped the attacker's calculation, proximity, timing, and a willingness to wait. Investigators would later say the weaponry involved included a crossbow and at least one bladed instrument. That combination is both archaic and modern, one foot in medieval reenactment culture, the other in online marketplaces where gear is reviewed with the brisk utility of camping stoves. In a suburban hallway, it becomes something else entirely, a way to take lives without alerting the neighborhood. That helps explain why the first sign to the outside world came not from sound but from absence, calls unanswered, a front door left ajar a fraction too long, a client arriving to drop off a terrier, and finding the house strangely still. Just before 7 p.m., the stillness ended. A 999 call brought police and paramedics surging into Ashland Close. Neighbors watched blue lights refract off car windows and hedges while officers moved fast but methodically, establishing a cordon that wrapped the cul-de-sac in reflective tape. Inside, 3 women lay fatally injured. Carol, whose kindness was community folklore, Louise and Hannah, sisters bound by work and the easy shorthand of a shared childhood. Outside, the air carried that faint metallic smell that always clings to emergency scenes. Generator exhaust, wet earth, the tang of latex and disinfectant. Within minutes, Hertfordshire police issued an urgent appeal. They were searching for 26-year-old Kyle Clifford and believed he might be armed with a crossbow or other weapons. The message was blunt and repetitive by design. Do not approach, dial 999, and it traveled with the speed of grief. Residents shared the alert in WhatsApp groups and on neighborhood pages. National headlines lifted the manhunt onto millions of phone screens. Helicopters began slow orbits. Units spread outward along the routes that link Bushey to North London. Arterial roads, woodland cut-throughs, towpaths, and the quiet geometry of cemeteries and parks where fugitives sometimes believe the city won't look. Behind the tape, detectives started the work that has no poetry. Grid the scene, label each room, capture every angle before the moment changes. Hallway measurements, luminol sweeps, the careful bagging of anything that can carry memory, fibers, prints, trace. The front step became a stage for white-suited forensic teams. Cameras clicked in bursts as evidence techs moved in pairs, one handling, one narrating into a recorder. A family's shoes in the hallway, the dog bowls by the back door, the garden gate latch that never quite sat right. All of it documented with the same impartial care as the catastrophic details. As officers moved through the house, the wider response shifted into a pace that felt both urgent and patient. Urgent because a suspect was at large, patient because haste breaks cases. Teams traced Clifford's recent movements, phone pings, CCTV threads from petrol forecourts and side street cameras, the low-fidelity images that become crisp once you layer enough of them together. A name anchored those efforts, a 26-year-old from Enfield, previously known to the family. That familiarity, proximity disguised as safety, is one reason domestic targeted crimes rattle communities so deeply. They violate the unwritten rule that the worst dangers are meant to come from the outside. Overnight, the policy conversation swelled. Commentators explained that under current rules, crossbows can be owned in the UK without a certificate. Proposals to tighten access had been discussed before, but the Bushey killings dragged the question from consultation papers into living rooms. Viewers learned new vocabulary, draw weight, bolt velocity, and none of it softened the human impact. The debate kept looping back to the same blunt conjunction: 3 women dead, a family shattered, a weapon that most people could buy as easily as a tent. Mid-morning the next day, the manhunt narrowed. Officers focused on the London borough of Enfield, Clifford's home territory, a mesh of residential streets cut by old green spaces, and the hushed lanes of a cemetery where yew trees throw deep shade even at noon. Searches moved quietly among headstones and hedgerows, boots whispering over gravel. Then radios crackled to life. A sighting, then confirmation. In a cemetery, officers located Clifford with serious injuries. No police firearms were discharged. Medics treated him at the scene. He was taken under guard to hospital. Back on Ashland Close, the floodlights dimmed, leaving the street in that peculiar post-incident hush where ordinary sounds feel conspicuous. The click of a garden gate, a sparrow on a fence, a car engine turning over. The house became a study in layered time. Yesterday's mug still in the sink, today's evidence markers numbering the floor. Across Britain, tributes multiplied. Colleagues of the family remembered the everyday grace of small interactions. Clients of the sisters' grooming studio posted photos of freshly clipped dogs with captions that might have seemed trivial any other week. Thank you for always being so patient. With him. Friends remembered how Carol's text carried a signature emoji and how you could hear her voice even when you just read the words on a screen. Police briefings remained careful and unadorned. They confirmed that 3 women had died at the scene, that a suspect had been located and was in hospital, that no one else was being sought. They avoided speculative detail about motive or manner, knowing that the precision of a future prosecution starts with restraint in the present. But the outline was already fixed. An attacker known to the family, a sequence that unfolded over hours rather than seconds, a crossbow among the weapons used, and a community whose confidence in the idea of home had been dented in a way that policy alone can't repair. By the end of that second day, the manhunt was over, but the longer work had only begun. Interviews, charges, the careful handoff from detectives to prosecutors. The legal path would eventually lead from hospital to custody, from first appearance to a courtroom where the facts would be set down in the pale language of indictments. For the country, though, the story's center remained stubbornly human. Carol's generosity, Hannah and Louise's shared enterprise, and a father's voice, so familiar to listeners, now threaded with a grief that felt personal to people who had never met him. By January 2025, the case that began on a quiet cul-de-sac in Bushy had traded blue tape and floodlights for wigs, gowns, and the careful choreography of an English crown court. The charge sheet was stark and specific. 3 counts of murder for the killings of Carol Hunt and her daughters, Hannah and Louise, false imprisonment, possession of offensive weapons, and a separate allegation of rape relating to Louise. What had felt, in the first days, like an impossible story was now being pinned down in the pale language of law. On a cold morning in late January, the court clerk called the defendant's name. Kyle Clifford, 26, formerly of Enfield, was asked to enter pleas to the murder counts. He admitted them. In the same breath, he also admitted false imprisonment and possessing offensive weapons, a knife and a crossbow, used during the attack. The courtroom was hushed. There was no drama in the way the words were spoken, only the kind of quiet that follows confirmation of what everyone already feared. Outside, headlines compressed the moment into a sentence. The man at the center of the Bushy killings had pleaded guilty to the murders, but the file was not finished. A jury still had to be sworn to decide the remaining allegation, that during the attack, Clifford raped his former girlfriend, Louise. That count had been denied. The prosecution's opening sketched the weeks leading up to 9th July 2024 with an unnerving, step-by-step clarity. Relationship ended on 26th June. Purchases made in the following days: a compound crossbow and bolts, a butcher's knife, duct tape, rope, large quantities of petrol. They described a man who, on the afternoon of the killings, checked which vehicles were on the driveway, searched online to see whether John Hunt would be at home, and walked to the front door concealing a knife in a rucksack. Jurors heard how Carol answered that door, how violence inside the hallway flowed outward through the house and across the hours, how Louise and then Hannah encountered the attacker as they crossed familiar thresholds: the kitchen door, the side gate, the front step that had always been safe. They heard that Hannah managed to raise the alarm before she succumbed to her injuries, that police arrived within minutes and found all 3 women fatally wounded, that a crossbow and a blade had been used. The prosecution then turned to the allegation of rape. They told the panel that beyond the murders, Louise had been subjected to a sexual assault during the ordeal, a calculated act threaded through with spite and control. Forensic evidence and digital material were set out with the meticulousness of a ledger. location data, seized devices, recovered items. The dull but devastating inventory that replaces guesswork with proof. Witnesses who never sought public roles found themselves giving testimony with the steadiness of people who know that clarity is a kind of mercy. Clifford did not take the stand. On several listings, he refused to come up from the cells. On others, he appeared only briefly. When the defense case closed, it was without an alternative narrative that explained away the prosecution's sequence. The judge reminded the jury that the guilty pleas to murder were not proof of the separate allegation, and that they must decide that count on the evidence alone. They did, swiftly and unanimously. In early March, the foreman read the single word that mattered: guilty. The court recorded a conviction for rape in addition to the already admitted murders and other offenses. For those who had followed the case since July, it was the legal acknowledgement of a cruelty that had been whispered about, but not yet fixed in the record. Around the law's steady progress swirled the questions the case had forced into the open. There was the grim, practical matter of weapons. A compound crossbow with hunting-grade draw weight, ordered without the certification that firearms require, a knife that would look unremarkable in any kitchen drawer. There was the planning, purchases spaced over days, reconnaissance of the driveway, a phone search to check whether the victim's husband and father would be present. There was the silence a crossbow allows, a mechanical thud instead of a gunshot crack, buying an attacker time inside a house where neighbors were close enough to wave, but too far to hear. There were also the human details that continued to break hearts, even as the case turned into paragraphs and counts. Colleagues described Carol's small generosities, the sort that don't make headlines, but change days. Clients wrote about how gently the sisters handled anxious dogs, how they remembered not just names, but quirks. Friends of the family spoke about the way the Hunts did ordinary things, shared playlists, garden jobs, the familiar cadence of home safe, texts after late drives, that now felt like relics of a world that ended on a Tuesday. As the jury filed out, attention moved to what sentence could possibly acknowledge the weight of 3 murders aggravated by planning, weapons, and an additional serious sexual offense. In England and Wales, the law reserves its heaviest sanction, the whole life order, for the rare cases where release will never be permitted. The murders of Carol, Hannah, and Louise met the aggravating criteria squarely. Multiple victims, use of a weapon brought to the scene, and the rape of one of the victims as part of a single course of conduct. The sentencing hearing was fixed for the following week. The judge, who had shepherded the case with a determination to keep heat from swamping light, signaled from the bench that the outcome would reflect both the facts and the law's hardest edge. He also noted the defendant's refusals to attend hearings, a choice that denied the families the small measure of dignity that can come from seeing a person face the consequences of their acts. The court made arrangements to proceed whether or not Clifford chose to be brought into the dock. Justice cannot wait on manners. In the days between verdict and sentence, tributes multiplied again, because grief doesn't follow a schedule. At racecourses and studios where John Hunt's voice is part of the national soundtrack, colleagues left messages that were part condolence and part promise that Carol, Hannah, and Louise would be remembered for their lives rather than for the brutality of their deaths. In Bushy, the sea of flowers at the end of Ashland Close bloomed, and then was tidied, and then bloomed again, the way communities keep vigil long after camera vans pull away. When the sentencing day arrived, the court gathered to do the last, hardest piece of its work. Prosecutors summarized the planning, the cruelty, and the admissions. The defense, with little left to say, pointed to the guilty pleas as a narrow strand of mitigation. Then the judge spoke, steady and unadorned, about jealousy and entitlement, about a crime planned across days and executed across hours, about the way an attacker exploited familiarity and silence to dismantle a family in their own home. He said the law's severest sentence was necessary. Sentencing day did not feel like closure so much as definition. In the high, wood-paneled calm of Cambridge Crown Court, the case that began on a quiet cul-de-sac finally acquired the law's hardest edges. Kyle Clifford, 26, had already admitted murdering Carol Hunt and her daughters, Louise and Hannah. He had also admitted false imprisonment and possession of offensive weapons, a knife and a crossbow, brought to the scene. A jury then found him guilty of raping Louise during the ordeal. All that remained was to set the weight of those facts into words that cannot be taken back. The judge spoke first to the planning. The relationship Louise ended in late June. The days that followed, during which Clifford bought a compound crossbow and bolts, a butcher's knife, and materials meant to restrain. The checks he made to learn who might be home. The way he used familiarity to cross the threshold. He described a man jealous, soaked in self-pity, who turned entitlement into a plan, and a plan into an attack carried out over hours, not seconds. Then he set the sentence that English courts reserve for only the bleakest crimes: life imprisonment with a whole life order. No release, no tariff to count down, no future beyond prison walls. Clifford refused to come up from the cells. He had also stayed away from earlier hearings, a pattern the court noted for the record, even as it moved on without him. Justice does not wait for a defendant's cooperation. In his absence, the room filled with voices that mattered more. John Hunt, whose commentary many in the country know by sound alone, addressed the man who had destroyed his family. He spoke of Carol's daily grace, the way she lit rooms with kindness, of Hannah's warmth, of Louise's bravery, how she had ended a relationship with clarity and care, and how that courage should inspire others to trust their instincts and leave when love hardens into harm. Amy, the surviving daughter, called Clifford what he is and what the facts show: a monster who brought weapons to a home and dismantled a family with calculation. Hannah's partner Alex described future plans, small and luminous, that ended on a Tuesday. The outline of the crimes, set out in sober detail, never lost contact with the house on Ashland Close. Carol answered the door to someone she knew. She was attacked first. Louise was restrained, assaulted, and murdered. When Hannah arrived later, trying to reach her mother by phone before stepping inside, she was shot with a crossbow. The weapon's quiet thud, so unlike a gunshot, had bought the attacker time. It is a terrible feature of crossbows in suburban rooms. They can be purchased easily and used in silence. That quiet is one reason neighbors did not know to run, and one reason policy, long a background conversation, stormed into living rooms after the killings. The court's job was narrower than Parliament's, yet even within the tight frame of sentencing, the judge noted facts that have wider meaning. Multiple victims in a single course of conduct, weapons brought to the scene, rape as part of the same planned attack, the exploitation of trust and proximity inside a family home. Those aggravating features are why the whole life order was not only available but necessary. No term of years could mark the harm. No future parole board could be asked to weigh risk against a family that no longer exists as it did. Beyond the courtroom, the country kept circling the same questions. Should crossbows be treated more like firearms, licensed, logged, their sale and delivery verified? Ministers had already set a review in motion even before Bushy. After the murders, that review accelerated, and proposals to tighten access were flagged in public. The facts now in the record give those proposals a human center: a mother and two daughters killed with weapons that, until recently, many people associated with hobby ranges and medieval fairs. Whatever policies follow, they will be read against the memory of a hallway where silence hid catastrophe. There were other facts the law acknowledged only in passing, but which linger in the mind. Clifford was found the day after the murders with serious, self-inflicted injuries in a cemetery in Enfield, not far from his home. He was treated under guard. In the months that followed, he refused to attend hearings. On some accounts, he will spend the rest of his life in a wheelchair. Those details do not mitigate, and they did not. The sentence turned on what he chose to do to 3 women who had done nothing but try to live ordinary days with decency. When the hearing ended, people spilled into air that felt too bright for what had just been said. Outside, statements from detectives were brief and pointed. An attack planned across days, executed across hours, answered with a sentence that means exactly what it says. Inside homes across Britain, race courses, studios, front rooms, where John Hunt's voice has been a companion for years, messages kept arriving. Colleagues promised remembrance without spectacle. Friends sent memories unvarnished. Carol's text sign-offs, the way the sisters coaxed anxious terriers to the grooming table, the small, funny stories families carry around like talismans. None of those anecdotes appeared on the indictment. All of them explain why the charges mattered. Grief never obeys calendars. Flowers at the mouth of Ashland Close bloomed and browned and bloomed again. A dog, skittish around clippers since the sisters died, learned to trust a new groomer. His owner still parks for a moment in front of the house and whispers thanks. In Enfield, the cemetery where the manhunt ended is once again only what cemeteries are: quiet, green, threaded with paths. And yet the news photo is fixed there forever for anyone who followed the story. If the law's job is to speak in numbers and orders, yours and mine is to hold names. Carol Hunt, Hannah Hunt, Louise Hunt. Say them in your head the way you say a prayer. Remember that the danger here did not come from a stranger in the hedgerow. It walked through a familiar door. Remember that Louise's decision to leave was not a mistake, but an act of bravery. Remember that a crossbow's silence is not innocence, that planning can wear the face of patience, and that home is a promise that must be defended not only by locks, but by laws, and by the willingness to listen when someone says, "I don't feel safe." The court has done what it can do. The rest is ours, to demand rules that match the risks, to make space for people to end relationships without fear, to insist that the worst kind of entitlement finds no cover in our homes or our courts. The story of the Hunt family will always carry horror. It should also carry instruction, and in time, a measure of love returned by strangers who refused to forget what was taken on a summer Tuesday in Bushy. Thank you for watching The Witness Record. If this case moved you, please like, share, and subscribe, and tap the bell so you never miss our next deep dive. Stay safe and stay observant.